Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's February 2022 webinar. My name is Kay Reed. I'm the Executive Director of the Dibble Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome Karen Benjamin Guzzo and Wendy Manning as our speakers for today. You know, last month we had Scott Stanley talking about research on cohabitation and sliding versus deciding. Today we have these two professors talking to us more generally and broadly about what's actually happening in young people's lives. And then next month, we're going to have a practitioner. So we really like this blend of webinars that we can bring to you. Some technical things first, housekeeping hints. If you can't hear us, do what you do with every other program that doesn't work for you online, log out and log back in. And if that doesn't work, consider calling in using the phone number that was in the email that you were sent with your invitation. We'll be taking questions and asking them throughout the program. So just please write them in the box you have on your screen. Secondly, I'd like to know how many of you are new to the Dibble Institute webinar. So if you would find the place where you can raise your hand, and raise your hand if this is your very first time at a Dibble webinar. I'd like to see how many people we can welcome and how many people we can welcome back. So please raise those old hands. Great. Great, about 20% of you are new, so welcome to you. Glad to have you on board. And 80% welcome back. It's Valentine's week, next week. It's our week, it's our month, and so we're super excited to be here. Alrighty, next slide, please. So a little bit about the Dibble Institute. These are our founders, Charlie and Helen. I do this because people say, where did you get that funny name and who's behind the screen? Got our name because Charlie Dibble founded this organization. He really had a heart for young people. He wanted them to have healthy, happy relationships, long-term family success. And next slide. We also want to let you know that we're a national independent nonprofit. There's no one behind the screen. It's just us folks. We're now in all 50 states. Thank you very much to all of you who are doing this good work. We're not a direct service provider. Instead, we translate research into teaching tools that we make broadly available to people to really impact kids on many, many levels: substance abuse, pregnancy prevention, violence prevention, mental health. There's lots of good reasons to teach a relationship skills program, and just let me know. I'd be happy to elucidate those with you at another time. All righty, next slide, please. So our mission is equipping and empowering young people with knowledge and skills to successfully navigate their intimate relationships. We want to help young people get smart about their love lives. This is not the only thing you need to teach young people. Of course, they need education in so many topics, and they need health care, and they need good housing, and they need, you know, all kinds of things that for their growth and development. But if we neglect this part, we think we're neglecting a really key part of helping young people be successful. Next slide. So 3 key values. We believe in research. We're research data wonks here. And so when we say that, what we mean is we base our programs in research, and when the research changes, when we learn more, and this is what we've learned in the pandemic, right? Masks, no masks, boosters, now, when, all those things. It's not that the science was wrong, it's that science changes, science learns, and that's what we do. The Dibble Institute is a learning machine, and we keep our programs up to date in the most recent research, so you can be really reassured that what you're teaching is rock solid. Next slide. We're big fans of safe, stable, and nurturing families, and often those are married families, not always. Sometimes they're single parent families, sometimes they're grandparent families. As long as they're stable, safe, and nurturing, that's really the best outcomes for kids. And I think that's probably what most adults want too. Probably not all, but most adults want to be in a safe, stable, and healthy place. So that's another one of our core tenets. And our last one is that everyone can benefit from relationship education. It doesn't matter who you love. It doesn't matter what color you are or where you live. If you live in a big town or a small town or north or south, east or west, whatever stage of relationship, if you don't have a partner, if you want a partner, if you used to have a partner, if you have a partner, everybody can benefit from relationship education. So that's a little bit about us. As I say, reach out to me if you have more questions about DIBEL. It's one of my favorite topics. So on to the show. I'm really pleased today to welcome Karen Benjamin Guzzo and Wendy Manning to our webinar. Karen is the director for the Center for Family and Demographic Research and is the co-lead. She has a very long thing, so I'm reading it here because it's so impressive. She's the co-lead of the research arm of the Marriage Strengthening and Research Dissemination Center. It's called MAST for short, and an affiliate of the National Center for Marriage and Family Research. She's a trained social and family demographer and sociologist, and most of her work examines, quote, non-traditional family behaviors. And in these days, you know, like what's traditional anymore? Dr. Guzzo also studies sexual and romantic relationships, looking at patterns and variations across groups. And Dr. Manning is the founding director of the Center for Family and Demographic Research and currently serves as the developmental core co-coordinator. She's the co-director of the National Center for Family and Marriage Research and the co-lead of the research arm of the Marriage Strengthening and Research Dissemination Center. I don't know how you get all this on your business card, Wendy. Her research examines how family members define and understand their obligations to each other in an area of increasingly diverse and complex family relationships. She's examined the meaning of cohabitation with her work on the measurement of cohabitation, fertility in cohabiting unions, and the stability of cohabiting unions, transitions to marriage, and implications of cohabitation for adult and child well-being. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Benjamin Guzzo and Dr. Manning. Please go ahead.
All right, well, thank you so much for having us here today. We are delighted to get to share some of the work we've been doing with the MAST Center, and I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at Child Trends who work on us with the MAST Center. This is a project funded by the Office of Planning and Research Evaluation. And so what we're going to do today is really talk about adolescents and young adults relationships and the expectations and attitudes and experiences that they have. And so with that, I will go ahead and dive right in. Of course, as many of you know, the teen and young adult early years are really a life course stage where a lot happens. It's what we call, demographers sometimes call demographically dense years. There are a lot of big changes that occur during this time period. So for many young adults, they're completing schooling. For some, this might be finishing high school and that's the end of their educational career. Some might finish high school and then go back to college or attend college later. Some might go directly on to college, but eventually most people finish school and don't stay in school forever. So they complete their schooling. A big part of finishing schooling for some of them is also moving out of the parental home. So again, for some people, this might be staying at home while they attend a local college. Some might leave home when they finish high school and move out with some friends or move into their own place. For some, it's going on and moving into the dorm. Sometimes these changes aren't permanent. Teens come back and young adults come back to the parental home. But eventually, most people do leave their parents' home and establish their own independent residence. This is also a time period in which young people start entering the labor force. So many teens have part-time jobs. This gives them an opportunity to not only make some money, but start to figure out what kind of jobs might appeal to them in the future, to figure out their career paths. And lots of teens and young adults actually have quite a few different jobs over these years, moving from different types of jobs based on what kind of needs they have, whether it works with their schedule, whether it meets their interest, whether it's a good fit for their particular sets of skills. But eventually the idea is that one will find a job or a career path that they can stick with. And of course, a big part of this is forming romantic relationships. This is another big thing that happens during the teen years and young adult years. They form lots of different types of relationships and have different partners at different points. And they may, as we'll talk about today, are looking for different types of things from these partners and learning from their romantic relationships. What's important to think about too, though, is that really the group of these behaviors together is what we call the transition to adulthood. And when we think, with someone an adult, when do people feel like a grown up? Well, it's sort of when they have all their proverbial ducks in a row. They're done with schooling, they have their own place, they have a good job, they make sort of a stable income, and they feel ready to maybe at that point settle down into more serious relationships and even potentially have children. What's interesting now, though, is that it is taking longer and longer for people to undergo these types of behaviors, to finish schooling, for instance. So many colleges don't calculate 4-year graduation rates, they calculate 6-year graduation rates. Sometimes this happens because people get into college and they have one major and they decide it's just not for them, and they explore different things. As I said before, sometimes leaving the parental home isn't a one-way trip. People come back. We saw lots of that during the pandemic. We see people moving around in different jobs and trying to find the right fit for them. And of course, it's taking longer and longer for people to get married. And that's some of the behaviors we're going to talk a little bit about today. And so in particular, as teens and young adults are forming relationships, there are some broader family trends that are happening that they're contributing even to, but that they're aware of. Some of the big ones of these are that we are seeing changes in marriage and the emergence of cohabiting unions where people live with their romantic partner but are not married to them. So as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, the age at first marriage continues to rise in the United States. So we're really at record highs, and we're not alone in this. In the United States and other countries are experiencing this as well. So from the 1950s, when it was during the baby boom and everyone was getting married rather young and starting their families, now we're seeing people taking longer and longer to get married. In part, this reflects the idea that marriage is sort of a capstone event, that's something you should do after you've completed most of those other transitional behaviors. So after you finish schooling and got your job and you've able to afford your own place, that's when you would get married. And this is a shift from what might have been the case maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. So by now, we're seeing that the age at first marriage is 28 for women and age 30 for men. However, the fact that people are waiting longer to get married doesn't mean they're not forming relationships. And in fact, what tends to be the case today is that for most people, their first time living in a relationship situation with someone, living with a partner, will not be marriage. It'll actually be a cohabiting union. And so most marriages today are not occurring against two people who lived separately and then move in together on their wedding day. Most marriages now are among two people who are already living together, and they're really just sort of formalizing their relationship with marriage. In terms of when people are forming these first cohabiting unions, we haven't seen a ton of change in this. This happens in early adulthood, where the average first cohabitation is around 23. And what's really sort of been interesting, that if you move away from just focusing on marriage to just when are people forming their first sort of really serious relationship and living with a partner, we haven't seen nearly as much change in that. It still happens in the early 20s. The other set of changes that have been going on that are kind of the backdrop in terms of what teens and young adults are doing are changes in childbearing behaviors. So right along with that rising age at first marriage, we are seeing an age at first birth increasing over time. And this is true across different populations, as I'm showing here, across different rural versus urban areas. It's continuing to increase. So in 2020, the age at first birth for women was about 27, and for men, it's about 3 to 4 years older. So people are waiting longer to have kids. You might remember her saying to yourself, well, if the age at first marriage is 28 and the age at first birth is 27, what does that mean? It means what you think it means, which is we're seeing quite a few births that happen to people who aren't married, although most of these unmarried births, non-marital births, are still to people who are living with their partner and in serious relationships. Part of what's contributing to the decline, or the age at first birth increasing, is a decline in teen childbearing rates. This is really good news. So in the 1990s, there's a lot of concern over high teen birth rates, but there have been quite a few efforts in different contributing factors that have led to teen births declining pretty dramatically over time. Birth rates for women 20 to 24 are also declining. And again, this is really part of the broader story. Is people are waiting longer to form their relationships, they're less likely to have children early on. So this is sort of the backdrop against which teens and young adults are forming relationships and sort of entering the romantic realm. So in this webinar today, we have sort of three groups of things we want to cover. We're going to talk about relationship and family expectations and attitudes, talk about actual experiences people, teens and young adults are having, and then get into some aspects of the quality of the types of relationships young adults and teens are having. A couple of quick things to kind of set the stage. When we're talking about teens, for the most part, the research we're covering is looking at people ages 15 to 19, and sometimes going younger than 14, but usually 15 or 14 and younger, but usually just 15 to 19-year-olds. When we talk about young adults, usually we're talking about people in the early 20s, but sometimes some researchers use this definition of up to age 30 to define young adulthood. I'll also mention that most of the research that we're covering and the statistics that we're showing you are for teens who identify as interested in different genders. So we're not reviewing research on LGBTQ teens or same gender relationships, in part because what we are trying to focus on here is usually nationally representative data. And so we're going to show you some original research we've conducted, as well as review some studies that have been published in the past 10 years or so. And until very recently, we weren't doing a good job in our national surveys or with broader statistics at gathering data about LGBTQ teens. All right. So let's start out by thinking about attitudes towards cohabitation. So in general, many people think that it's risky to marry someone unless you know a lot about them and are really sure that your marriage is going to make it. And so many people think that cohabitation, living with your partner beforehand, is a good way to know whether or not your marriage is going to work, because it helps you know if you're compatible with your partner. And so we can analyze and look at responses to trends over time in whether people think cohabitation is a good idea. And so for teens, there's a data set called Monitoring the Future. And what this is, since 1976, has interviewed high school students, and just every year there's new high school students and they do a new survey. And so what's neat about this is we can track trends over time in what teens think. And so this is a question, it is usually a good idea for a couple to live together before getting married in order to find out whether they get along. And so this looks at high school seniors. So these are high school seniors every single year. So it's not the same groups of people, but it is always basically roughly around 17, 18-year-olds. And what you can see over time is that there's been a big increase in the proportion of teenagers who think that living together before marriage is a good idea. And so by now, in recent years, we're up to almost 70% of people think it's a good idea, and it's to live together before marriage, whereas only 15% disagree. And then the rest are sort of the neutral people who weren't sure. In terms of whether or not people expect themselves that they will get married, that they will live with a partner outside of marriage, the answer is pretty much, yep, they do. So in general, we see here that the majority of both teen girls and boys think that they will live with a partner either prior to marriage or any partner at all if they don't plan on getting married, so that they do think this. And in fact, it's becoming less common for people to expect to marry someone without living together ahead of time. And so in other research, not shown here, it's only about a third of young women, 18 to 24, think that they will marry without living with their spouse beforehand. So we can see that even just over the past decade or so, there's been an increase in the acceptability, or the expectations rather, that teens will live with a partner. And we do see that teen boys are sort of more often say that they will live with someone outside of marriage than teen girls do. Turning to marriage, the majority of teens do think they'll marry. There's a little bit of change there, but not as much as you might expect. Part of it really seems to be that people aren't necessarily rejecting marriage, but there's rising uncertainty. So this is that same survey that asked teens surveyed teens over and over and over again since 1976. So this is sort of a kind of a quirky question, I think, but you can track trends. So which do you think you're most likely to choose in the long run? And so teens were giving choices: get married, they have no idea, or not get married. And so if you look at that first line, you can see that the peak was sort of around 2005, 2006, where 81% of teens, these are high school seniors at this point, said, yes, I will get married. So it's still pretty much the majority, but by the most recent time point, which is roughly around 2019, we're down about 10 percentage points to 71%. But what's also interesting is that you look at that bottom line there, it's not that people are saying, nope, I'm not getting married. It's that middle group that's really sort of increased over the past few years, where there's more uncertainty around whether people think that they'll actually get married. As a sort of caveat to some of these questions, or some of our definitive takeaways, it does seem to be the case that how we ask these questions matter. So this other survey sort of said, what is the chance you'll get married someday? So not what is this, in the long run, what do you think is most likely, but what do you think your chances? So if we just ask teens this with a different data set, we sometimes get a different story. So here, this uses the National Survey of Family Growth. It's another sort of big survey, but it's only asked this question for a few years. But here you can see we're looking at the share of teens 15 to 19 who said either definitely yes or probably yes, I'll get married someday. And here you see it's sort of the vast majority, so much higher than the 71% we see in that other data set. But either way, I think the takeaway here is that yes, the majority of teens do think that they will get married. We don't see really big gender differences here. And we don't see a lot of changes over time in the past decade. Finally, thinking about whether people want to have children of their own, the answer pretty much still is yes. So we hear a lot in the media that people aren't having children anymore and people are rejecting the idea of becoming a parent, and that doesn't seem to be the case, at least for teens. So there's maybe a small decline among teen boys, but it's still, nearly 9 out of 10 teen boys and 9 out of 10 teen girls expect to have a child in the future, at least one. And so gender differences are pretty minimal here at this point. So kind of to sum up, their attitudes. So yes, the majority of teens expect to cohabit and, they expect to be in a romantic relationship. They expect to marry. They expect to have children. So teens today are really not rejecting families wholesale, despite what sometimes seems to be the case in the media. What we didn't have a chance to sort of explore, but we're happy to talk about later, there is some variation across different sort of demographic or socioeconomic and relationship experiences in terms of their expectations. So not surprisingly, you might expect that the teens who are in relationships and young people who are in relationships do have higher expectations of marriage. So when this seems like a real possibility for you and you actually have someone you're with, you start to think more seriously about marriage, and it might be in your future. And we do also see that people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, so higher levels of poverty, or whose parents are less well off, they are less likely to think they'll get married, but they still think they'll form a relationship at some point. Of course, we would all know that just because you expect to do something or you have a favorable attitude towards something doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do it. And so in that instance, we want to talk just a little bit about some of the experiences teens are actually having and young adults are actually having. It's important, though, to have this sort of as a backdrop that, given that teens are spending, that the age at first marriage, the age at first birth are increasing, what we see here is that teens have a lot of time and young adults, have an increasing proportion of their lives spent sort of kind of out there dating but not marrying. So we know that, if we think about the adolescent years, if people aren't getting married at 20 or 25, but getting married later and later, what this means is there's a long period of time for which teens and young adults will have various relationship experiences. And that's really where we're coming from, is what do we know about that time period right now? Well, one thing we know is that the share of teens who report having ever dated has declined over time. So this is, again, that monitoring the future data. And so here I've got 3 lines. That first line there is the high school seniors, and then they do ask this question of high school 10th graders and then 8th graders as well. And so what you can see here is there's a decline over time in the share who report having ever gone on a date. I'm going to give a little caveat though, and we'll come back to this in just a second. The question literally is, how often do you go on dates, or something like that? And if you know teenagers and young adults, that really might not be the best term. So when we say the share of teens who have ever dated has declined, what we really are saying is the share of teens who responded yes, they've gone on a date has declined, but maybe there's other things going on, and our questions just aren't measuring those. It's also, of course, worth pointing out that, even though teen dating has declined, perhaps, but it does seem to be the case that as teens get older, more of them have gone on dates. So you see the difference between 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. So I just made, that point. And then I do want to point out, we don't actually ask a ton of questions on teens dating experiences in our surveys, and we ask even fewer about young people in their 20s about dating. We start to focus on other things. We ask lots of questions about sex. We're always very concerned about whether teens are having sex and under what circumstances. There is some evidence to suggest that the age at first sex is increasing over time too, but even so, it's the case that by age 18, roughly 2/3 of teens have had sex. So at this point, we have a little poll for you, and I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Wendy Manning, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of the terminology, maybe. We'll come back at least to talk about the terminology of teens dating relationships. All right.
I think everybody should see the poll on their screen, and then will Kay or Esther tell us the results, or?
So the results are, or Esther, you can put that up on the screen. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I'm Wendy Manning. I'm just going to pick up on some of what we've been going over here, and anybody who's spent time with adolescents, you don't have to be a researcher to know this, that the dating word is not used that often, and so this term talking to is popular, and I think what you as a group have reflected on and you understand, and the hanging out with are two common words. If you have other words that you think are used, we'd love to see those in the chat. And this is
actually put them in the questions box. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
But we'd love to see them for sure.
Yeah, we'd love to learn more about the terminology, and many of you have more direct experiences with this than we do. And as researchers, as Karen was showing you, we're trying to track trends. So we weren't asking people 20 years ago, are you talking to somebody? So we can't really measure that over time. So we're a little bit stuck. But what we're pretty sure of, no matter how you decide you want to measure it, is that teens are engaging in some kinds of relationship, and the language used to refer to those relationships is shifting, and it's certainly tricky, but merits further attention. So I think the next slide, Karen. And so basically, as Karen had said, that the young adults are focusing, maybe we could see the graph, we're focusing on co-residential relationships. So by age 30, after they go through all of their 20s, this is telling us the share of young adults who've ever cohabited, ever had a child, or ever got married. And so in recent years, what we're learning is that cohabitation has sort of surpassed marriage as the experience that occurs in young adulthood. And then what happens after into their 30s is that's when we're seeing more folks have married than cohabited by then. We know that most people who marry have lived together beforehand. About 3 out of 4 people who recently got married had lived with their partner before they did so. And so this just shows you that most young adults have been in some kind of relationship. Most have been in some kind of co-residential relationship. But there could be very differing kinds of experiences, and they might have started and ended many kinds of relationships. And so we talk about this in some of our other research. We can come back to it at the end. So overall here, we just say that fewer teens are dating, no matter kind of how you measure it. Sexual activity is happening at later ages. We know that we have some some people are having sex outside of relationships. Some people are in dating relationships without sex. So both kinds of activities are occurring. The language we use is shifting, and we know less about the experiences of people into their 20s because we're usually looking at this through a marriage lens and not so much of a developmental lens. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about relationship quality, and we're going to review some of the limited research really on this topic. And I think it's important to think about more because we really don't want to treat adolescent relationships or young adult relationships as sort of mini marriages or adult relationships light, that they really are unique. And often we frame our research questions around an adult frame, and we supplant that marital perspective. And so at this time, we think it's really important to treat them as a unique developmental phase, which is, if you talk to any developmental psychologist, they think that dating in adolescence is developmentally appropriate, and that's really exciting for teenagers. They're trying out new relationships. It's the first time, and they're going to stumble and they're going to have problems and challenges in how they manage these relationships, and they're not going to manage them the same way that those of us who are a lot older are managing them. So just to focus on that adolescent period is really important. And so we've framed our discussion today around 3 themes. And so the first one is really how couples interact together. And we think about positive forms of interaction, such as a fundamental quest really for emotional and physical attachment or affection. People are seeking someone who has picked them or selected them. It's mutually beneficial relationships where emotional support is provided, where someone has your back. Sometimes there's instrumental support, which might be more appropriate as we move into older ages. When we think about negative interactions, we're often framing these around coercion, controlling behavior, and criticism. And these are all important because they're indicators of power and control. They can range from really subtle indicators that are very difficult to detect to really obvious measures, and they can be psychological, such as intimidation or threats, and then they can also enter the physical realm. We'll talk a little more about that. Another topic that we've talked, another way to frame relationship quality is relationship satisfaction. Some surveys ask these really simple questions: how satisfied are you, or how happy are you? And what they really mean by that is how fulfilled are you in your relationship? How is this relationship meeting your needs? Some people focus on specific domains such as communication. And we all know that communication is really critical because we're learning how to express ourselves and be supportive, but also get the support we need out of relationships. Another part of satisfaction is shared activities. So the really important part is being autonomous, but also being interdependent. So we don't want people to be too dependent. It's sort of a tough balance of people are too dependent, then they're quitting and not being involved in some of the activities that bring them joy or satisfaction, and giving that up for a relationship. So we talk a lot about that. And then again, this idea of support is critical at all stages of the life course, but especially I think in adolescence, when people are entering these new types of relationships and are making themselves quite vulnerable in ways they haven't before. And then finally, we think a lot about context. And this is really important, and I'll come back to this theme in a minute, is thinking about duration is not always tied to quality or positive outcomes. So longer relationships don't always have more positive, don't always result in more emotional satisfaction. And it's really part of the marital lens that stable relationships are good relationships. And we try to think about, in adolescence, we really need to teach young adults and adolescents how to start and end relationships. So we have to be careful about that duration frame. In thinking about expectations for the future, it's how long do we think these relationships are going to last. If you talk to teenagers, they're super excited if it's lasted for 2 months or 10 months. Oh, that's a landmark. And so we just have to be receptive to what the duration of these relationships mean. If we look at young adult relationships, they usually last longer, but still they're often just the duration. These expectations are really just tied to forms of commitment. And sometimes people need to be realistic about their future expectations. And we sometimes have people talking about they're looking for a soulmate. And that's really hard to achieve at any age, but especially in adolescence and early adulthood, when really these periods of exploration, it's hard for someone to fill all of those demands. And then we also think about, in terms of context, union status, dating, and cohabiting relationships. And you've heard us talk about that, and that's more about young adults. And as Karen had mentioned, the age at first union formation, where you start living with somebody, is often in your early 20s, but the date that you start getting married is usually in your late 20s. And so what do those cohabiting relationships mean that are different than dating relationships? And how do you navigate starting and ending those kinds of relationships? And I believe Dr. Stanley talked extensively about that last month, and I checked out his webinar, and I suggest you see that if you're interested in that more. So we have 4 items that we really want to focus on that are related to some of our research, our own research on relationship quality. And this is back to this idea of duration, and that just because they're not long doesn't mean they're not meaningful. And so often we think about adolescent relationships as being quite trivial because they're short, but in fact they're quite meaningful to them, no matter what the length of the relationship. And the next one, switching my notes here, is uncertainty and churning. So adolescents are starting out on relationships. They might they don't follow a linear path. So we think about, even this is true in marriage, we think about you get married and you stay married, and your marker of an end would be a separation or divorce. And in these dating relationships, there's a lot of blurriness about when relationships are starting and when they're ending. And about 40% of adolescent relationships have experienced some kind of breakup and get back together. And what we need to keep in mind are those are really sensitive periods for negative relationship dynamics. Maybe you might be choosing to have sex with somebody else. People might be involved. We have some evidence that in those periods are when we might experience more relationship conflict as people are trying to navigate the end or the start of their relationship. Another theme that I think is really important to think about is trust. And we have in adolescence, this is really critical because part of this stage of development is moving outside of the family realm in the wider circle and trusting and engaging with people outside that realm who you have less information about, and you're putting yourself at greater risk. And this is true. Issues about trust and jealousy and infidelity are all tied to high levels of relationship conflict, sometimes anger, and it's important that these issues, though, are dealt with maybe in adolescence in a different way than they are in adulthood, and especially because people think about this largely in terms of sexual behavior, but even just in terms of emotions and feelings, and that adolescents are opening themselves up and making themselves vulnerable. It is really critical, and it bears paying attention to. And then a final piece that is really important that's tied to trust and jealousy and infidelity is intimate partner violence. And what we're talking here is largely about physical conflict, but of course we need to be really mindful of non-physical conflict that can be emotional, psychological, even sexual forms of intimate partner violence and coercion are all important, and they're intertwined together. And while relationship conflict is normal, it's when it moves to the physical realm, it's not. And it's complicated. It's driven not only by, it's often mutual. It's not just one person who's a simple perpetrator or victim sometimes. And what's of concern is how people are managing their relationship conflict through intimate partner violence. And so you want to avoid building these negative relationship patterns. And so we're trying to encourage people to think more about how folks manage conflict. In the interest of time, I'm going to have Karen just flip forward on all of these here. And these are, we have a review of the literature and that we can share this with you. And we have a lot of evidence that indicates how adolescent and young adult relationships are different. I think this group of our audience probably is well aware of that in their own work. And so I'll just put this forward as a reminder that these are very different developmental stages, but also ones in which, especially adolescence, is probably more challenging. And there's some notion that you don't want it's important to start relationships, these adolescent relationships in adolescence, while you have the scaffolding of parents and educators and community members who can help you figure out when things go wrong. And then in young adulthood, people might not have that support or infrastructure to help them navigate relationship problems. So just something that we can talk more about in the Q&A. And then our next question here is trying to, I think, summarize what we've been saying. I'm just flipping through my notes, I'm sorry. Is that just taken together that we don't think there's one universal or one size fits all, and just to remind us, and important for us to remind adolescents and young adults, that no one is perfect at relationships, that everybody makes mistakes. And we often focus on the negative, but sometimes we really need to remind ourselves and that there's so many positive aspects and features to these relationships that are critical for developing emotional well-being. And that often that just because a relationship break up, it can be heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, but it doesn't mean always that that's a negative outcome. And it's important for young adults to learn how to start and end these kinds of relationships. And just, I think I would be remiss if I didn't make a mention. Oh, one more slide here. Let's talk about this. About that, we just argue they're important, and then we have sort of, there's two themes that are often going on, that there's baggage, where the trajectories of your adolescent relationships are brought forward into young adulthood. That's kind of a negative view of it. We prefer to think about this as a learning curve, and that you learn how to do relationships, you learn how to start and end, what works and what doesn't work for you. Some of these relationship experiences from adolescence will be carried forward into young adulthood, and the research literatures rarely consider that longitudinal or that long-term effect. And so that's something we want to bring to your attention. And just, I was thinking more about the programming, and that I'm sort of preaching to the choir that all of you have a lot more experience in terms of the programming realm than the rest of us. And just to be aware that when we are teaching our adolescents and young adults, that they're turning to all sorts of venues for information, including programs, including family, community, social media, and that we want to develop programs that are age appropriate. And we need to also think about programs that recognize diversity in people's experiences and the context and family, neighborhood that they have grown up in, and also thinking about diversity in their own identities in terms of their gender identities, sexual identities, and race and ethnic identities. And I guess, and just one final point while we're on the implications, is thinking about what this all means during the pandemic. I was, of course, there isn't any, there's probably some preliminary research that's out, but what we're still trying to learn more about is what this means. And we have to really think about that adolescents have really gone through a really traumatic change as our lives have become upended, and how they socially interact with one another, and they're no longer doing that in person in the same way or at schools in the same way, and how that and how they're working through that. And I think for some, there's some relief in that. They don't really want to be interacting so tightly with all of these peers and friends and all the drama. And for other people, they really are missing that part of their lives. And so I think we need to pay attention to how adaptive our adolescents and young adults are, and how flexible they are as they and how they emerge through the pandemic, and what this will mean for their relationships moving forward. And then finally, we'll leave time for questions. We just want to acknowledge our the MAST Center and encourage you to visit this resource. We will have a brief and some data visualizations about these themes that will be coming out. So we encourage you to visit it, and our research partner, Child Trends, has many other important resources related to adolescent and child well-being. And then also, if you enjoyed a lot of the graphs that you saw at the beginning about changes in marriage and family, those data visualizations, come visit our webpage at the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. Our data profiles are updated. We have 4 or 5 a month, so we'd appreciate you coming to visit that as well. And I just want to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Karen. We have some questions. So Angela, this is like you're gonna be Dear Abby here a little bit, but from an adult's perspective. Angela asks, in general, I try to encourage postponing dating as long as possible so the teens can figure out who they are, what their boundaries are, and just to avoid all the drama. Is that bad advice?
I don't know if that's bad advice. I think you want adolescents to engage in these relationships. It seems as if that's they're going through so many cognitive and psychological and biological, physiological changes that's a natural part, is to be attracted to others and want to develop these relationships. And I think if we don't want to, it's probably a both and answer here. Like, you want to encourage them, but I can see providing a lot of support for those relationships and what's appropriate and what's healthy to occur in those relationships. But most of the research I've been seeing, they were really saying you don't want people to have start on their first date when they're 25, right? Because then they haven't had that experience, and it might end up with more negative, might be more negative implications. But there's probably no one answer for that.
I think what's also, sorry, just to piggyback on that, is to say that I think the nice advice about, though, is maybe not so much discouraging people to date later, so much as telling people there's no pressure to date if they don't want to yet. Yeah. And to go at their own pace. So I think that's the nice thing about it. So we don't need a one size fits all. Some teens might be interested in doing this, and some teens sort of have the same view, that they're like, I don't need the drama. I see other people go through it. I don't want that. And I think that's what's really nice today, is that we're recognizing that some people might be ready to date and want to, and some people might be ready to rush in to be committed, and other people want to take it slow, and other people are in no rush to date because they love their friendships or their sports or whatever other hobbies they have, and that's fine too.
So would you encourage group dating first? Or is it, again, not one size doesn't fit all?
I don't know whether you encourage it or not. I think that's what happens. I think teens like to do things in groups, and in part, maybe that's a social media function as well, is that people sort of make plans in group chats and on social media, and they see what everyone else is up to. So I think, again, it's sort of what people feel comfortable with. I think it tends to move is that people are in larger groups hanging out at schools, and then they sort of move those to outside of school and social situations, and then sometimes there's sort of a pairing off, but it just sort of reduces the cost, and it's less pressure, when you're with a bunch of your friends and also with someone you might like.
So we had several people asking the question, what is sex? So when you asked in the survey, what is the age of first sex? what is in that context?
That's penis vagina sex, like actual intercourse.
Okay.
So clearly teens are doing other things. There's lots of ways that teens experiment with what they're interested in and things that they're willing to do without going, you know, quote unquote, all the way. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are all sorts of experiences teens have, but in particular, what we're seeing is that teens are waiting longer to actually have, you know, intercourse with someone of the opposite gender or different gender.
Okay, yeah, and vaginal intercourse. Okay, so in the 2 surveys you cited, I'm assuming what Karen meant was, I'm trying to do a little ESP here, that the race ethnicities of the teens taking the survey questions, and I'm assuming those are questions around marriage. You used the future study and another one. Do you know was that a representative sample around the U.S. or were they only talking to the rich kids or the poor kids?
No, it's a survey of all, it's naturally represented data. So that was important for us. So there's lots of studies out there on different groups of teens and they're sort of smaller studies. And we really didn't focus on those because it's hard to generalize. So for us, we were really trying to emphasize data that's nationally representative. I did have some notes here somewhere, kind of got lost in here about what the young adults' expectations are. So for instance, among attitudes towards cohabitation, we know that one of the things that we saw is that seniors who identified themselves as Hispanic were most likely to think it's a good idea to live with somebody outside of marriage as a testing ground, compared to about 74% of Hispanic seniors agreed with that, compared to only 69% of white and 65% of Black seniors. In terms of marriage, white teens were most likely to think they would get married with lower levels among Black and Hispanic teens. So there are some race ethnic differences among those as well, though we didn't get into that here.
Great. So a question about, do you think finances and cost of living are factors that contribute to the delay in marriage?
Oh yeah. Wendy, you want to take it? Yes, we know that. Yeah.
The short answer is yes. And so that people really feel like they need to be financially set before they get married. This is something that was different than when the first age at marriage was 20. People didn't have to be financially set. They were still finding their way. Now you need to have everything. People are concerned about making sure that they're with the right, not only that they're financially set, but that they're with the right person. And so that's one of the rationales that's used for cohabitation. I want to test out the relationship and see if this is the right person for me. A lot of people talk about being having a fear of divorce. The divorce looms large in their minds. They want to avoid it. One way of avoiding divorce is never to get married, but another way to avoid divorce would be to wait and make sure you're marrying the right person. And so I think there is a concern on both fronts. So, but yes, definitely people want to make sure that they can afford not only to get married. Some people want to be able to afford a certain type of wedding. So in some of the interviews I've done with people would, you know, be very concerned about that. I think those are some just kind of viewed as prerequisites for marriage.
Yeah, sometimes people don't use this terminology, but what they're talking about is basically sort of there's a bar for marriage, that you have to have done these things or have this level of financial security. It's not about a specific dollar amount, because that would vary for person, but it's feeling secure and feeling like, you know, your income is stable. And sometimes it's even for people to say, well, I won't get married until I think I can afford the wedding that I want, and then or until I can have, you know, afford to have children. So they think about the cost of kids. So, you know, once you get married, you have to have kids, or, like, you know, that's why you get married, so then you can have kids. And for some people, and so they want to make sure they have all these you know, they're set for the future. And we don't have that same kind of bar for living with a partner. So people are willing to live with someone, and sometimes they live with someone for a long time and they know this is the person they want to marry. And what they're doing is they're waiting because they just don't feel like they have accomplished all they need to accomplish to get married.
Alrighty, what is the impact of religion on teen sex, dating, marriage, cohabitation? Essentially, what is the impact of religion on their relationships?
So when we think about religion, in some research they talk about specific religions, but usually there's thinking about religiosity, which is sometimes measured by frequency of attending services or how important is religion in your life. And people who are there's some variation in there's not that much variation probably in some of the views about that I want to get married. That doesn't seem to vary a lot by religion. But what might matter is more about the timing of some of those events. And so that could differ. People who are more religious might feel it's more important to be married before they start having children. So there might be, there's some work about that those two have to, those events have to line up. So we see earlier ages at first marriage for people who are more religious or express a greater religiosity.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned early on in the webinar that young people are saying it's a good idea to live together to test compatibility for before marriage. Excuse me if I mispronounce your name. I think it's Kaya or Kaya. Asks, are married couples, is there any data about married couples reflecting back and saying it was a good idea or not a good idea to live together before marriage?
That's a good question. Karen, do you know of some, I don't know about that study. You gotta do a survey. We'll have to, I mean, we know, I don't know.
I mean, Wendy's done some work, and so I'll let Wendy speak to this, though. There is research showing that people who live together before marriage have more stable marriages in general. I don't know if, Wendy, if you want to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's some concern that cohabitation is associated with more negative relationship outcomes, and that there is not much evidence for recent marriages to support that. So some of the research that you're hearing about is covering a long period of time. But if you look at people who've been married, since 2000, you're not going to observe that same pattern. And you actually see that in some ways that cohabitation is a testing ground, and that people do break up their cohabiting relationships. And now cohabitors are almost more likely to break up than they are to get married. And so people are having sometimes more relationships in adolescence. So they're not only just living with their spouse before married, they might be living with another person besides their spouse before they get married. And so that's another piece of the puzzle when we think about that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to wrap this up by giving you the new language, the new vocabulary for dating. Here's some. Lillian says linked up. Kaya says we're just friends with benefits. Tracy says, young people, she works to say they have a boyfriend even though they've never met in person, just on a dating app. Teens use dating to mean a committed relationship, and talking to or hanging out to describe a developing relationship. And then this is the new one, kicking it. I hear teens saying they are kicking it with them. So those are the new things you can add.
Okay, well, we'll add those to our growing list of terms for adolescent relationships. Thank you.
Right. Karen, can you flip back on the slides, please?
Yep.
So again, thank you to Dr. Manning, Dr. Benjamin Guzzo for joining us. And for those of you who are here, we're going to archive this webinar. It'll be up in the next couple days. We'll make sure you get that link. If you have questions, ask us at Relationship Skills. There's a survey. We read them all, so please answer. It's not a graded test. Next slide. We have continuing education credits for some of our webinars, so head on over to dibblesinstitute.org/CEUs if you need CEUs. The webinars are free and the CEUs are incredibly good value. Next slide.
Somehow it disappeared. Hold on one. There we go.
Okay. And stay in touch, all the normal ways we do that. So, please be our friend. Okay, next. Trying to get done. Next month, We're going to be talking with a provider in Utah that's using a Mind Matters, our Mind Matters program with youth in care, and hearing how they use it, how they do mindfulness, how they're helping build resiliency and increase hope in these young people. So we're really excited to have that. So with that being said, we're done for February. We're so glad to have you. Have a great Valentine's Day. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Wendy. And we'll see you all next month. Take care.
Thanks a lot, folks.
Bye-bye.